Okay, yes, yes. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And wanted to take this opportunity also to uh, also thank Dorothy Sommer, Dr. Desiree Shostak, and Angelina Andik. I might have mispronounced your name of the university, and the Heidelberg University for Jewish Studies, as well as Jacob Kolofer of the German American Institute at Heidelberg. So thank you both for organizing and hosting me today, and thank you all for spending your evening here with us tonight. So, more than 8 months have passed since the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel and the subsequent war in Gaza. And I wrote this book. It took me a good 7, 8, 9 years to actually finish writing this book. When I began my research, I thought that the paradox was very interesting here. There's a paradox in Israeli politics where Netanyahu, the longest-serving Israeli prime minister, is often seen as Mr. Security, or at least used to be seen as Mr. Security by the Israeli public. And when you looked at the former generals, the former heads of the security establishment, security services, they did not see him and never have as Mr. Security. They saw him more as a security liability. So I thought that was a very, very interesting paradox. And I was happy that Cambridge University Press picked up the book, and I was working on my final set of proofs that I submitted on October 6th and was told, that's it. I can't add any more words unless I see a real error. And I go to sleep wondering, what am I going to do this weekend? And of course, I don't need to tell you what happened on October 7th, and it did not take a lot of convincing for my publisher to agree to have me write an addendum or an epilogue, given what happened, and afterward is actually what we called it. So I look at this paradox, and I draw on the civil-military relations literature as well as the literature on populist nationalism. These are normally two distinct literatures that are not combined, but I think both of them are very important in explaining contemporary Israeli politics. And my research is based on dozens of interviews, mostly in Israel, some in D.C., with former heads, and including a few active members of the Israeli security establishment. And I also had many meetings that were off the record with academics and experts in the field. Now, my key argument to explain this puzzle of why the public has largely stood by or had stood by Netanyahu all these years, despite the opposition from the members of the security establishment, is that the status of the security establishment has declined over the years. The generals do not have the same kind of luster, the same kind of status that they once held in Israel. And the populist nationalists have taken advantage. They've exploited this kind of growing gap in order to fulfill their own political ambitions. Now, when we look at this question of why it is that the security establishment is opposed to Netanyahu, and why Netanyahu also does not like the security establishment in particular, there are three major reasons: lack of agreement, lack of confidence, and lack of trust. With respect to lack of agreement, the security establishment, it's not that it's a monolithic community, but by and large, they see themselves as fulfilling the Zionist dream. And the Zionist dream is a secure Israel that is a Jewish and a democratic state. And those two factors, a Jewish state and a democratic state, are both essential to fulfilling the Zionist dream, as far as most members of the security establishment are concerned. And so they are very concerned about the growing state of affairs in Israel, growing the move towards binationalism, which they feel threatened the Jewish character as well as the democratic character of the state. So there are disagreements over the future of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and that kind of drives this lack of agreement. With respect to lack of confidence, the generals see Netanyahu as a man of words, not action. He's somebody who gives speeches, and he's very good at giving speeches. In fact, he's coming to Washington, D.C. in a few weeks to give, you may have heard, to give his, fourth address to a joint session of Congress. And I think he's the only person other than Churchill to have given this many joint appearances in front of both houses of Congress. So he's somebody who relishes words, not somebody who is necessarily as comfortable with decision-making and actions, which is what generals typically see. And finally, there's a lack of trust. From day one, Netanyahu sidelined the security establishment. I'll get to that in my talk. And these days especially, because of course we are going to talk a little bit about the events of October 7th, these days especially, they see Netanyahu as pursuing his personal and political interests and putting those interests above the national interests. So these are kind of the three major reasons that there is this lack of support and confidence in Netanyahu. I want to say a few things about this, the history of civil-military relations in Israel. In Israel, although the military is subordinate to civilian control, unlike the typical Western democracy, there's more of a blurred lines between the military and the civilian spheres. The military has always taken on a more active role in Israel than is typically the case in Western democracies. Yoram Perry refers to this as a partnership, quote unquote, between the generals and the politicians. And although a coup has never really been a realistic possibility, oversight of the IDF has never been particularly strong. The most visible manifestation of the blurred lines between the military and civilian spheres is the uniquely Israeli phenomenon of former generals parachuting, quote unquote, into the political arena upon retirement. Israel has a long tradition of former generals who enter politics as a way to continue their service to the public. 3 of Israel's 13 prime ministers were retired generals, 2 of them former IDF chiefs. And the vast majority of IDF chiefs have gone into politics upon their retirement. So what's also really interesting here is that most, but not all, of these former generals tend to join parties that are to the left of Netanyahu's right-wing Likud party. This is not to say they're all left-wing, but they definitely are less ideological, which usually means less right-wing in the Israeli political context. And so they've joined kind of center or center-left parties. And it is not surprising that the very first right-wing Israeli prime minister, Menachem Begin, in order to strengthen his legitimacy, picked a former general to serve as his defense minister. Same thing goes for just about every right-wing Israeli prime minister. Shamir did the same. Netanyahu did the same. And in most of those circumstances, the defense minister, who, as I said, was a former general, would have falling out with their boss because they felt that their boss wasn't doing what they needed to do on the question of land for peace and the larger Arab-Israeli conflict. And I'm happy to give some more specifics here, but rather than throwing out a bunch of names, I'll mention Yitzhak Mordechai, not because he's the most significant of these generals. Others like Moshe Dayan and Ezra Weizmann were more significant. But with the case of Netanyahu, the reason Yitzhak Mordechai comes to mind is he was Netanyahu's first pick as defense minister, and Netanyahu served from 96 until 99. In 1999, he ran for re-election. This was his first re-election. And Yitzhak Mordechai, as defense minister, teamed up with the outgoing IDF chief of staff at the time, Amnon Lipkin-Shahak. They both formed the Center Party, a new party, to challenge Netanyahu and send him into retirement. And in those elections in 99, it was yet another former IDF chief of staff, Ehud Barak, who ultimately defeated Netanyahu. So the conclusion that Netanyahu reached after that humiliating defeat was that the generals are his main political rivals. He really needs to watch out for the generals. And so years later, he orchestrates, through his proxies in the Knesset, a law called the Chalutz Law. This is not the official name of the law, but it is it's known as the Chalutz Law. Dan Chalutz was, at that time, a popular IDF chief who was seen as harboring political ambitions, like most of them do. And the law basically extended the cooling off period from 3 months. From 3 months. Want to make sure I get this right. 6 months to 3 years. In other words, after the retirement of a general, they can't immediately go into politics because of potential conflicts of interest. And up until that point, up until 2007, the generals were allowed to run 6 months later. But with passage of the Chalutz Law, now generals had to wait 3 years. And so Netanyahu's supporters claimed, well, this is a democratic move in order to prevent conflicts of interest. But the real intention was to thwart political challenge from an ex-general at the height of his popularity. Because 3 years later, many of them will have been forgotten. Some of them might even be too old to run for office. And this trend of generals challenging Netanyahu for public office, not only did that trend not go away, but in the 5 inconclusive elections that we saw in recent years, an unprecedented number of generals challenged Netanyahu. 3 of them formed a political party. A couple of them left. A few others joined in. And we've never seen this number of former IDF chiefs challenging a sitting prime minister. This has never happened before. So this is all very unprecedented. Want to say a few words about the IDF's influence over the years on government policy. I mentioned that the IDF has had relative autonomy, which means that they have done they've had some influence in shaping government policy, and that you could trace this back to the 50s, to the mid-50s, when Ariel Sharon, who was then a kind of young commander, took matters into his own hands when he carried out counterterrorism operations, counterterrorism raids, even when they were not officially sanctioned by Prime Minister Moshe Sharett. And so this was something that was highly unusual, but became kind of almost a norm in Israel. By the mid-60s, it actually became the norm for IDF generals, including Yitzhak Rabin, who was the chief of staff, to give media interviews, press interviews on political matters. Again, that's something that's typically not seen in the Western world. One of the biggest rifts in civil-military relations in Israel was in the lead-up to the Six-Day War, where the generals had basically what amounted to a revolt against Prime Minister Eshkol. And throughout 1966, a year before the war, they had really pressured the prime minister to exploit Israel's advantage and preempt the war rather than waiting until Nasser would act. And Levi Eshkol, who was kind of notoriously indecisive, refused to do so until he got LBJ, President Lyndon Johnson's approval. And only once he got Lyndon Johnson's, let's say, amber light — it wasn't exactly a green light, but it wasn't a red light either — once he told him, we need to do this, we need to step in and take care of our challenges here, only then did he did Israel launch this war. But the generals were openly fuming against the prime minister at the time. Later, in the late 1980s, it was the top IDF officials, the top brass of the IDF, that pressured the Israeli political leadership to pursue peace with the PLO. You might recall the first Palestinian Intifada, which began in December of 1987. And this was something that Rabin, as defense minister, tried to put down by force, unsuccessfully, because this was not your typical war against a foreign army, against an Arab army. This was young, teenage and young Palestinians with nothing but rocks and maybe some primitive weapons, Molotov cocktails, who could not be defeated, short of a massacre. And so the generals pressured Rabin and Shamir, who was prime minister at the time, to engage in a peace process with the PLO, which ultimately happened when Rabin won those elections, became prime minister in 1992, replaced Yitzhak Shamir and his labor-led government, primarily due to Shimon Peres and Yossi Beilin, more dovish members of his government. The Oslo peace process, of course, took over, and Rabin was eventually killed, assassinated by a right-wing religious extremist in Israel for making peace with Yasser Arafat. When Netanyahu defeated Shimon Peres in 1996, he really made sure to curtail the IDF's influence. So no longer were the generals invited into cabinet meetings. No longer were the generals going to be involved in peacemaking with the Palestinians. And so here began a new era of distrust between Netanyahu and the generals, and not just the generals, but also the heads of the Shin Bet and the Mossad security and intelligence agencies. And he routinely ignored their recommendations, dismissed their counsel, and so we really see the beginning of a rupture in relations back in the 1990s. Now, the general's status in Israeli society has evolved over the years. The IDF has traditionally been seen as the people's army, quote unquote. It's an important source of national pride, identity, and social integration that embodies the Zionist idea. David Ben-Gurion, the nation's first prime minister and defense minister and founding father, really saw the IDF as kind of a melting pot, a unifying social, not just military institution. And the victories that the Israeli army had, that the IDF had in its first wars, the 1948 war, the 1956 Sinai campaign, the 1967 Six-Day War, these were seen as almost miraculous that tiny Israel was able to defeat all these Arab armies who were much better armed, much better funded, and the generals were seen as heroes in Israel. An entire generation saw them as heroes. This begins to end with the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which was the biggest debacle in the country's history. By the way, the October 7th Hamas massacre took place within a day or two of the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. But this really shattered the IDF's image, and the Agranat Commission that was set up to investigate the failures of the Yom Kippur War pinned a large share of the blame on the IDF Chief of Staff, David Elazar, and other generals. and recommended replacing them or suspending some of them. And so the IDF's reputation was definitely damaged at that time. And since the Yom Kippur War, Israel would continue to see kind of an erosion in the IDF's once hallowed image in Israeli society. The 1982 Lebanon War was often referred to as Israel's Vietnam. The 2006 Lebanon War, this was the second Lebanon War, ended in a stalemate with Hezbollah very strong. And as I speak here, as we sit here, Hezbollah is resuming attacks on Israel that some feel may escalate into yet another war with Lebanon. Similarly, all the different Gaza wars and operations, of course, the current one being the largest, have all ended inconclusively with Hamas still in control. And so despite the IDF's clear superiority as the strongest army in the region by far, Israel really hasn't had a decisive victory for many, many years. And there's been a changing nature of warfare that's been characterized by these low-intensity conflicts. We're seeing a lot of urban warfare in the case of Gaza, for example. And so the situation has changed, and these kind of clear-cut victories no longer exist. And in addition to these failures, there are also some perceived failures and perceived debacles that the public has that they associate the IDF with. One is the 2005 withdrawal, disengagement from the Gaza Strip. This was a unilateral withdrawal decision by Ariel Sharon, who was pressured by the generals and the Shin Bet security service chiefs to withdraw from the Gaza Strip, which Israel did in 2005. And many Israelis blame the generals for that debacle. And then I mentioned earlier the Oslo peace process of the 90s that the generals were associated with. And that, too, Oslo has been seen as a failure over the years, especially since the failed Camp David II summit of July 2000 and subsequent Palestinian Intifada, the second and more deadly Palestinian uprising. So it's against this backdrop that the nationalist politicians in Israel have attacked the security establishment as part of their political playbook. Now, it's useful to note that this is not Israel's first time with populism. Menachem Begin, who I mentioned earlier, the first Likud, the first right-wing prime minister, was very much a populist. But as Dani Filk, an expert on populism, has noted, this was more of an inclusive form of populism in the sense of bringing members of marginalized communities inside, including them in the political process. So in the 70s, Menachem Begin was able to tap into the frustrations of the Mizrahim and the working class, those who had been excluded, and made them feel like they're part of the process and brought them into the political mainstream, using populist tactics, of course, to do so. Under Netanyahu, on the other hand, we're seeing a more exclusive form of populism. There's basically an us versus them approach here, and which differentiates the kind of average Israeli from those who are seen as part of the elite. And that includes the Arabs, even though they're not the elite, but they're lumped in with the left. The Arabs, the elite, the left, the educational institutions, and this is much more of an exclusionary form of populism, as Dani Filk has noted. And so in the Netanyahu era, especially since his comeback in 2009, where he did make a comeback and has been prime minister almost continuously since then, with the exception of the short-lived changed government that was led by Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett. He's been prime minister pretty much since that period. And he's introduced, or his government has introduced, a whole slew of illiberal bills in the parliament. Some have passed, some have not passed. The most controversial one was the so-called Jewish nation state law of 2018, which declared Israel as the nation state solely of the Jewish people and omitting any kind of reference to equality, minority rights, and inequality, of course, was enshrined in Israel's Declaration of Independence, but that was not mentioned at all in this very controversial bill. I want to mention the media here because the media, both traditional and social, has served as a very important vehicle for Netanyahu's nationalistic populist appeal. Even as he has fiercely attacked, he and his supporters have fiercely attacked the media for being against him, but he's been able to use them for his purposes. And during the Trump era, what's interesting is that Netanyahu adopted the same terms and the same kind of language that we heard from President Trump. Terms like fake news, witch hunt, deep state. These are all terms that Netanyahu never used until the Trump presidency. And when it comes to social media, we see a lot of populist animus in the social media pages. Netanyahu's elder son, Yair, has his own social media accounts. He advises his father, at least unofficially, and is very active in this kind of these attacks, not just on the kind of traditional institutions, but also on the IDF and the Shin Bet. The year 2016 represents a key turning point in this open assault, this populist assault on the IDF. There were 3 events, back-to-back events in 2016 that are worth noting. The first was then IDF Chief of Staff Eisenkot, Gadi Eisenkot's speech at a high school. And this was during a very tense time in relations with Israel's Arab minority and with the Palestinian minority. And there were a lot of terrorist incidents in Jerusalem and elsewhere throughout the country. And in his speech, Eisenkot said that a soldier must only kill terrorists if there's an immediate threat to human life. And I'm going to quote, this is from Gadi Eisenkot's speech, when there's a 13-year-old girl holding scissors or a knife and there's some distance between her and the soldiers, I don't want to see a soldier open fire and empty his magazine at a girl like that, even if she's committing a very serious act. Instead, he should use the force necessary to fulfill the objective. And he was widely attacked by right-wing politicians and right-wing media pundits for that speech. That was in February. A month later, there was the notorious Elor Azaria case. So Elor Azaria was an Israeli soldier who was filmed shooting and killing an unarmed Palestinian assailant who was in the process of committing terrorism, but he was basically put down, and instead of being arrested, he was shot to death by Elor Azaria. So his commanders, the soldiers' commanders, decided to arrest him because he had violated the Army's code of ethics. And once this happened, all hell broke loose in the Israeli public and in the media, and right-wing politicians pounced on this, took the side of the soldier against the commanders, and you really saw a big split between those, including Defense Minister Bogi Ya'alon, who was a right-wing conservative defense minister for Netanyahu, who sided with the commanders as a former IDF chief, sided with the Army Code of Ethics, versus Netanyahu and the right-wing populists who sided with the soldier. And then finally, there was in May a speech given by IDF Deputy Chief of Staff at the time, Yair Golan, on Holocaust Remembrance Day. And in this speech, he called on Israelis to engage in a deep reflection and nip the buds of intolerance, the buds of violence, the buds of self-destruction on the road to moral degradation. And noted that some of what he was saying, some of the processes in Israel, reminds him of processes that had taken place during the Weimar Republic here in Germany. So, as you can imagine, this did not go over well at all. And he later said that his words were taken out of context, and by no means was he comparing the Nazis to the populist right in Israel, but there were some buds of intolerance that needed to be addressed that were not. He was so severely reprimanded that he was ultimately denied a promotion to chief of staff, and today he's the newly elected leader of the Labor Party. So this assault on the security establishment is a very significant development, and we've been seeing an increasing number of these attacks on the IDF chiefs from various politicians, most of whom are associated with Netanyahu. Some of them, for example, one of Netanyahu's allies, David Bitan, has complained that Israeli intelligence chiefs become leftists in their posts. He's complained that the cabinet's hands were tied because the IDF chief wasn't recommending operations in Gaza at the time to quell border unrest. He called the Shin Bet, the domestic intelligence service, cowardly. Miri Regev, who's another Netanyahu ally, called the security service delusional. And these are just a few examples. We see many more of them just in the last few months in the wake of October 7th, where this really continues in an effort to pin the blame for the debacle of October 7th on the security establishment instead of Prime Minister Netanyahu. I mentioned that there's been this erosion of trust in the public and the IDF, but I do want to note that the Israel Democracy Institute, which has been tracking for years trust in various institutions in Israel, and has found a remarkable drop in trust in institutions, from the courts to the media to other institutions, has found that despite all of the attacks on the IDF, despite its diminished status in Israeli society, the IDF still is the most trusted institution in Israel to this very day. About 86-87% of the public still say they have trust in the IDF, and every poll taken since October 7th have found that Israelis trust the IDF significantly more than their government. And so this brings me to last year, 2023, which was a very pivotal year for the loss of Netanyahu's Mr. Security image. First, we saw the demonstrations against the government's judicial overhaul last year. And we saw week after week a consistently large number of demonstrators throughout the country, in Tel Aviv, but also in Jerusalem and places that in the past you would not see such large demonstrations, protesting against the Netanyahu government's plans to weaken the judiciary, to weaken the Supreme Court. And key players in these protests were Army reservists, especially those from elite units like the Air Force and other elite units, who said, if we are going to risk our lives for this country and continue to volunteer our services and reserve duty, we're not going to do so in a non-democracy. And so they were very active. This lowered morale in the IDF to the point that the IDF chief began to speak out, and even Netanyahu's own defense minister publicly called for a suspension of the controversial legislation. Once he did so, that was in March of last year, once he did so, Netanyahu promptly announced he was firing him, and there were spontaneous demonstrations, massive demonstrations, that broke out after Netanyahu's announcement in support of the embattled defense minister, Yoav Gallant, because I think this was a key turning point in the public's view of Netanyahu, looking at his action as really self-serving as opposed to looking out for national security. And ever since then, most polls, almost every poll taken since then, has shown that he has lost that Mr. Security mantra. And of course, the second major event was the Hamas assault of October 7th of 2023. And to this very day, we have seen several high-ranking generals announced a resignation, taking responsibility for what had happened. The IDF chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, has not resigned, but has taken responsibility for the debacle, as have the heads of the Shin Bet and the Mossad. But the one person who, as of today, has not yet indicated that he has any responsibility for October 7th is Netanyahu. And this is not lost on the generals, of course, nor is it lost on the Israeli public. So there are some important implications that I want to just highlight briefly. One is that Israeli democracy hangs in the balance. We don't know yet who is going to prevail. Will it be the populist nationalist politicians that I mentioned, or the IDF chiefs and other gatekeepers of democracy? But the Zionist dream of a Jewish and democratic state is clearly in danger, and this is all part of a broader culture war that we see in Israel. Secondly, U.S.-Israel relations are going to be significantly impacted by all of these developments, and we already see a growing partisan divide over Israel between Democrats and Republicans in the United States. We see a growing rift between the Jewish diaspora in the U.S. and Israel, with younger Jewish Americans questioning Israeli policies much more than the older generations. And this is an election year, of course, in the U.S., and we're seeing a growing rift even within the Biden administration, within the Biden White House. And I think we're going to see much more of this in the coming years. And finally, there are going to be significant economic ramifications for an illiberal Israel if Israel does continue moving in an illiberal direction. Israel has for years been called a startup nation, and for good reason. But a lot of companies, a lot of startups are actually thinking about packing their bags and moving elsewhere under the current climate. Moody's Investor Services last year warned about the negative consequences if the government went through with its judicial overhaul. And earlier this year, they lowered Israel's credit rating. So if you think about Israel's top asset, which is its human capital, this is very much threatened. So I'd like to, though, end my talk on a slightly more positive note by making two positive points. The first is that the pro-democracy movement last year, that to some extent is ongoing because we're seeing these weekly demonstrations that have a different character, but still ongoing to this very day. Every Saturday night, you'll see tens of thousands, sometimes even more, on the streets in support of democracy. The fact that more than 20% of Israelis took part in one or more of these weekly demonstrations, the fact that despite so many months of these demonstrations, the protesters haven't let up, and the fact that the army reservists have played this key role shows us kind of resilience in Israeli society that a lot of people didn't think was there. People are willing to fight for their future and for their democracy. And in some respects, that offers a masterclass on how to confront illiberal forces that are threatening so many democracies around the globe today. And secondly, and lastly, I want to note that tragic events can sometimes bring about positive change. And even though it's very hard to be optimistic today in light of the ongoing devastating war in Gaza, and with a hardening of attitudes on both sides, we should keep in mind that 4 years after the Yom Kippur War, Anwar Sadat visited Jerusalem, visited Israel, and subsequently signed the first Arab-Israeli peace treaty. The first Intifada paved the road to the Middle East Peace Conference and the Oslo agreements. And recently, Saudi Arabia, which is the current leader of the Arab world, has made it pretty clear that they're interested in joining a normalization effort in Israel. They have a few conditions that need to be met first. So there are definitely some potential positive developments on the horizon, but this requires, of course, bold and effective leadership that currently we're not necessarily seeing. Thank you very much.
Yeah, many thanks for this talk. I wrote my MA thesis back in the day in Heidelberg on Israeli civil-military relations. So I'm particularly fascinated by the topic, and I have a few questions myself. And then we'll open this up for your own questions and comments, either in English or in German. Microphone too much. Okay, let's start with maybe a few topics. Cheers. You focus basically on this kind of clash between populist nationalism and the military establishment. So I want to focus on other elements of Israeli civil-military relations, which also play into the picture. Let's start with a question of demographic shifts within both Israeli society that also have an impact on the military itself, right? What the Hebrew-speaking students in the final row, the term hadatta, so religionization, the increasing impact of kind of religious Zionist, both on the secular school system, but also on the army have. And if we look at even at the Gaza war, if you look at a few pronouncements of kind of commanders from the Zionist or religious nationalist sector, they seem to see this as kind of a religious war, right? So we're fighting against Amalek and all these topics. So how do you see this impact of religionization, both in Israeli society, but also how it impacts the army as a supposedly professional body?
So it's a great question, and this is actually a theme that I do explore somewhat in the book. It's a real problem in some respect because we're seeing a demographic shift, a real demographic shift, whereas in the past, it's not just in terms of numbers in Israeli society, the number of religious people or people defining themselves as religious. Many more young people today than in the past see themselves as religious. It's also the types of recruits that are going into the IDF that are motivated to serve. And in the past, it was typically the kind of Ashkenazi elite, you could say, that made its way through the IDF. It was their career. And over time, they discovered that it really was not as beneficial. It wasn't as lucrative. They can go into the high-tech world. They can go to the private sector. And it's the marginalized communities, the Mizrahim and the religious youngsters. This was an opportunity for them. And so there's high motivation on their part to serve. And so we're seeing this changing face demographically. And as you correctly note, we're seeing some rebellion here. We're seeing some calls by some of the more extreme rabbis, for example, IDF rabbis, to rebel against and reject orders that they feel are not consistent with halacha, with Jewish law. And it's too early to tell, though, what is going to be the consequence. And the reason I say this is because we also see a gap between young recruits, even and their commanders on the one hand, and higher-ranking generals on the other hand. So even some of the more religious IDF soldiers who had become generals over the years, they've moderated their tune, and so they're not necessarily pursuing the same zealot-like behavior that we're seeing from the younger ones. And so part of it is experience, but it's really an experiment that is unfolding. And it's not exactly clear what's going to happen. What is clear is that the mechinot and the yeshivot, the pre-army religious institutions, I would venture to say, do a lot of brainwashing. And some of them teach very, very extreme religious Zionism in a very kind of extreme way. And I think that does influence the thinking of a lot of the soldiers. And so I am worried about the future.
I'm sure other people would have asked the question, but I'm going to ask it right away. Namely, the question about the people who don't serve. So one kind of the strangely positive effects that this war is having on Israeli society is that among the troops that actually do serve, you have both the left-wingers, like the classically Ashkenazi, stereotypical elite from the kibbutzim, and you have the right-wingers, and you have Mizrahim, Ashkenazim, the moderate center. But of course, there's people who don't serve, right? So it's Israeli Palestinians or Israeli Arabs, and it's the ultra-Orthodox.
Right.
Just got a new law that helps them kind of to evade basically 3 years and maybe very soon 4 years for army service. How is this playing into this infighting in Israeli society? Because the ultra-Orthodox are part of the Netanyahu coalition, so he can't lose them. But long-term, there's a lot of anger about the fact that they don't serve, and a lot of them don't work. Right?
Absolutely. And this really shows you the kind of schisms in Israeli society that are highlighted by these controversial bills, by these very contentious legislative maneuvers that are, again, designed for political purposes. These do not address in the long term what needs to happen, because you have all of these, during a war. This legislation you're describing is happening during a war where the IDF needs more reservists to pursue a war that Netanyahu says will continue indefinitely until Hamas is quote-unquote destroyed. So how do you do that without extra recruits? And yet he also knows that if he's going to remain prime minister, he needs this ultra-Orthodox support. In the past, by the way, the ultra-Orthodox did not align themselves with either the right or the left. They served every government who was willing to fund their yeshivot and work with them. And it's become much more polarized in recent years, where now they firmly are on the kind of right-wing bloc, right-wing camp. And that's one of the reasons that's led to this kind of paralysis, where we've seen so many back-to-back elections in Israel that make it very difficult for either the center or the right form a big coalition because of this problem.
I'm currently teaching a class on the Israeli army based on Hebrew sources, and I think a few students are here. You mentioned the Aganat Commission after the Yom Kippur War. Let's imagine the war is over, God willing, this year or the next year, and we would have such a government commission.
Yes.
How would you imagine the outcome? So looking back at this war, what might be the potential outcome of such a governmental inquiry into both the political elite, but also the military elite, and how both contributed in a way to October 7th?
So, first of all, I think there's some things that are fairly obvious at this point, such as the fact that nobody really knew that October 7th was going to happen, that both the IDF and you can add the Shin Bet, as well as the political establishment. So in other words, military and security and the political establishment grossly underestimated the ability and the willingness of Hamas to perpetrate these attacks. The working assumption was Hamas, as the governing body of Gaza, is going to spend more time and effort to develop life for the Palestinians in Gaza than worry about attacking Israel. So that clearly was proven wrong. The details, though, of who gets more of the blame, that we of course cannot predict. What I am worried about is that the makeup of the commission is itself going to be a source of contention, because who will be presiding over this commission? Who will be serving in this commission? And in an era of polarization, it's going to be very hard to have a consensus just on forming this committee. Also, it takes many months for such an investigation to take place, and this commission hasn't been formed. The war is not even over yet. So as far as Netanyahu is concerned, let this drag on indefinitely. That's okay. By the time they actually are formed, by the time they deliver the report, which may or may not be accepted, it may be an issue of contention. It's not really clear what's going to happen. So I don't think this is going to go in the same way that the Yom Kippur War Aganat Commission went.
Final question from me, and then we move over to your questions and comments. We just encountered this puzzling idea by the ICC, International Criminal Court, to basically accuse Netanyahu of very severe crimes, right? And with the kind of the the only mechanism that might save him from this judicial process would be this principle of complementarity, right? So once kind of the Israeli judicial system would kick in, then the ICC would have to say, well, national judicial system is taking care of it, so we have to kind of take a step back. Is this even, can you even imagine such a process, as long as the war is going on, that people within the judicial system would have to say, obviously there's war crimes and perhaps even crimes against humanity happening on the ground, and maybe in a way Netanyahu is responsible for this in the end because he's the prime minister. Would we have to wait for such a government commission? So how do you see the reaction of the judicial sector playing out in this competition between the political establishment and the military establishment?
So in Israel, the perception of the ICC and also the international, the ICJ, is decidedly negative, and there's almost a near consensus, not a consensus, but a near consensus that whatever it is they do is very politicized, that they're seen as highly anti-Israel, highly biased, putting Hamas and Israel on the same footing. So I don't think that regardless of who's in power in Israel, regardless of what coalition is for, I don't think there's going to be any difference when it comes to dismissing out of hand whatever it is that they say. So nor does it necessarily have a bearing on what an Israeli commission would do. I think that's what Israelis would take a lot more seriously. What happens within Israel? What does the Israeli Supreme Court have to say? What is a future investigative body in Israel? There's talk within the IDF now of the IDF investigating IDF war crimes, where there's clearly been abuse by some soldiers or their commanders of Palestinians. These are internal matters that I think Israelis would take much more seriously than these outside bodies.
Okay. With that, many thanks. Floor is yours. Lots of time left. Ideally, you ask your questions in English. If you feel more comfortable in German or Hebrew or Arabic.
Okay, I think we have to mention also Mr. Crime Minister. Okay? So if Netanyahu is not Prime Minister anymore, let's say, he will stand his famous trial, which goes for years.
So is that a comment or a question?
No, it has to be mentioned.
Yes. So that's a good point. So I did not mention something that I should have mentioned, which was, as you point out, Netanyahu is the first sitting prime minister under indictment. Now, before Netanyahu won that re-election in 2009, before he made his comeback, Ehud Olmert was the prime minister who took over Sharon after Sharon's massive stroke. And Olmert was under all kinds of corruption. He was involved in all kinds of corruption cases, which put a cloud over his future. And at the time, Netanyahu said, you cannot possibly focus on your duties as prime minister with all these corruption cases pending. And so Olmert resigned, not only because of Netanyahu's pressure, but it was just interesting that Netanyahu then is not only involved in his own series of corruption scandals, but was actually indicted. And so when I mentioned earlier that many in the security establishment see Netanyahu as pursuing his political and personal interests ahead of national interests, this is partly what I had in mind, because the whole judicial reform of last year was aimed at weakening the courts, and every party in the coalition had their own reason for backing this legislation. And Netanyahu's reason, of course, was to stay out of jail. So yes, absolutely, this is something that has dragged on and probably will drag on for many more months, possibly years, before, and he might even get a plea deal at the end. It's hard to imagine Netanyahu is going to end up in prison, but that happened with a former prime minister.
Thank you for the great presentation. So my question is, for the war to end, at least does Netanyahu and the so-called generals, do they have an objective, same objective on what should this end of war should mean, or what you call this victory could mean?
Okay, well, very good question. So they share, there are two objectives that the political and military establishment share. One is a return of the hostages, a return of all the hostages, the Israelis held captive in Gaza. And the second is destroying, or at the very least weakening, significantly degrading Hamas's capabilities. So one thing that I think they agree on is that Israel cannot return to the October 6th situation. That's not going to work for Israel. You cannot have Hamas firmly in control of the Strip and threatening again, which Hamas has openly said it would do, to commit further assaults. Where they significantly differ, however, is in the so-called post-war plans. And this was the pretext that led Benny Gantz, who up until now was in the emergency national unity government, the war cabinet, to resign. He and his fellow IDF chief of staff, partner Eisenkot, their party pulled out of this emergency government precisely because Netanyahu refused to endorse or propose any coherent post-Gaza war strategy. And that's where I think they really differ on. They would like to know who's going to be in control afterwards. If it's not going to be Hamas, will it be a revitalized and reformed Palestinian Authority? Well, Netanyahu says absolutely not. No PA under any circumstances. So we know what he doesn't want, and he's much less clear about what he wants, in large part because he doesn't want to lose his far-right coalition members. He knows that the minute he does propose any sort of coherent post-war plan, they're going to be at his throat. So he has intentionally been waffling on this question of what to do after the war, which is why it's also in his interest to keep the war going until Hamas is destroyed.
I am a friend of Netanyahu because his brother was the hero of Entebbe, and he brought the refugees back. And what makes Netanyahu wrong?
I'm sorry, what makes
Netanyahu now wrong?
What would be the strong case for Netanyahu? Like, why do people actually like him, right? Because he has huge followers.
Yes, so Netanyahu is by far the most charismatic leader Israel has had, at least in this century. None of the other politicians come close. He's been called a political magician, and his political obituary has been written on numerous occasions, and yet he's still prime minister. So he is definitely a superb politician, and we can question whether he is a superb statesman or a superb leader, but he's definitely a superb politician who also understands the power of the media. And so that has worked in his favor. He is the person who introduced American-style politics in Israel. When he ran in 1996, he hired an American campaign strategist to help him. This was the first time that Israel ever did anything of that sort. And he came up with very catchy slogans. Paris will divide Jerusalem was one slogan. Netanyahu, a strong leader for Israel, was another. So this really has worked over the years. And so there are many reasons that he has been able to. He's also knows how to play the politics of divide and conquer. He's been able to, win enough allies and knows how to also. One of the reasons that the so-called change government collapsed, I mentioned briefly earlier that there was a change government for a year and a half up until that was formed actually 3 years ago. So up until fall of 2022. And one of the reasons it collapsed is Netanyahu was able to figure out how to get enough defectors and offer them plum awards, plum jobs for defecting to his side. So that's how I would explain his strength. That's definitely his strength.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting discussion and conversation. We're talking a lot about military here, and one thing which is not very known or not very discussed in Germany is the fact that the support for the Israel army in terms of weaponry and arms is coming from two countries mainly in the world, which is, if I'm informed right, 65% US, and the rest is Germany plus a little bit from Italy. So maybe a hypothetical question, but in the interest of how strong the Israel army IDF really is, hypothetical, what would happen to the war and to IDF and to Israel if both those countries would stop arms export as of now or immediately?
Clearly, it would harm the IDF. I mean, no question about it. It would harm its ability. And one of Netanyahu's talking points, especially in recent weeks, months, is that Israel is alone. So Netanyahu is downplaying not only German aid, but even the U.S. aid that he gets from President Biden. He really has downplayed that. We know that when Iran was sending over all kinds of missiles into Israel to avenge Israel's bombing of their consular division in Syria previously, the U.S. and other countries, including some Arab countries, stepped in to help. So even, beyond just the military support that you're talking about, intelligence cooperation, other forms of cooperation has been very, very important to Israel, but it is intentionally downplayed by Netanyahu. It also sometimes is downplayed in order to be sensitive to those other countries. So, for example, and this may be less relevant with respect to Germany, but when Arab countries cooperate with Israel, which they do all the time, it really is not in their interest for Israel or anybody to highlight that cooperation, given the level of animosity towards Israel in all of these Arab countries. But yes, I agree with, I think, your premise here, which is the IDF is very strong and its intelligence is excellent. And its abilities are excellent, but at the end of the day, it would be weakened without the U.S. support and perhaps also without the German support. Somebody here is in the middle here, second row, third row.
Thank you. I've read an interview where an Israeli veteran criticized the policy before October 2023 for their choice of distribution of troops. They placed very much troops at the West Bank and much less at the border to the Gaza Strip. Is this also discussed in this context?
Yes, so I'm very curious. We talked earlier about the future commission of inquiry, which I think we both expect will happen at some point. But I'm very curious as to whether they will point to that, because this was around one of the Jewish holidays. And this happens quite often where the settlers living in the West Bank want extra protection. They feel they need extra protection. Some more divisions, more battalions are sent to them. But I think this problem is broader because the community in the so-called Gaza envelope is what they call it. They have for years and years and years complained that they were vulnerable to these rocket attacks from Hamas, from Islamic Jihad, from other militias in Gaza, and that the government was basically doing next to nothing to help them, to protect them. And so this, I think, is a broader problem, not just that specific timing of the Hamas attack, which worked obviously in Hamas's favor, but I think it's a broader question of neglect. Why are the communities in the southern part of Israel and for that matter, in the northern part of Israel bordering Lebanon, why are they neglected? Whereas the small religious communities in parts of the West Bank that are in areas that are obviously very much in contention, why is there so much focus on protecting them? And a lot of it is political.
Thank you for your talk, firstly. One question, you could say the two-state solution has failed after this incident. Are there any major movements, maybe in the ADF itself, of a Arab-Israeli combined state or something like this?
So I was hoping nobody would ask me this, because tomorrow morning I'm going to be speaking about this.
Tomorrow morning, 11 a.m., Hochschulfuture-Studien.
Yes. So I hope you and maybe a few others who are in this room will be able to join us tomorrow, because I definitely want to go more in depth on this very important question, on the question, what is going to happen with this two-state solution or one-state solution. What I can tell you in a nutshell is that all this talk about a one state for everyone, one state solution is really pie in the sky, really not going to happen. It's not realistic, because I don't see any scenario where Jewish Israelis and Palestinians are going to agree to share the land with full equality, which means new institutions. That would require the majority to give up, their state in a sense. It would also invite further bloodbath. I don't see that happening at all. But part of the problem is that the status quo, which again I'll be talking about tomorrow morning, the status quo is also leading towards this new binational reality, which is not a solution, but is becoming more and more of a reality, because if there's not going to be a separate, independent, sovereign Palestinian state, then you are going to have this kind of binational reality, which is far from the vision of a one-state solution. So I think the name of the game still is the two-state solution, although Netanyahu has made it crystal clear that that's not going to happen under his watch. And Hamas, of course, has also been pretty clear that it won't happen under their watch either. So don't hold your breath.
A few days ago, there was an interview with one of the founders of the Human Rights Watch, Aryeh Naher, and he described Israeli behavior towards the settlers, the attitude of the army sort of being an accomplice of that kind of behavior. He was clearly asked, is this fascist? And he agreed. Would you call it fascist? He repeated, this is fascist. What is your opinion on this?
So I don't know if I would call it fascist or not, but that definitely exists, where you have, I don't think it's official policy by any stretch of the imagination, but you definitely see incident after incident of the army looking the other way, or soldiers that are meant to protect everyone looking the other way when there's almost like two different systems there. Not the same punishment. It's not consistent. And so when a far-right religious extremist Jewish extremist takes matters into his hands, vigilantism or something else, they usually get a slap in the wrist. But if a Palestinian commits a terrorist act, the army takes that much more seriously. So there's definitely double standard, which is, just to kind of bring this into full circle here, why the Supreme Court is so important here, because the Supreme Court has often, not always, but sometimes sides with the Palestinians in these kinds of cases, which is one of the reasons that the political right and the religious right in Israel really wants to weaken the Supreme Court. So there is a little bit of a check, but not enough, and clearly there should be more done in the IDF and the recent IDF chiefs of staff have actually talked about this. So this is a well-known problem, you could say.
So I listened to what you just said, and I was very strongly missing the bare fact that there are two laws in the West Bank, and the Palestinians live under a totally different law than the settlers. And it's by law that a youngster Palestinian throwing a stone disappears in a jail for indefinite time, and a youngster of the settlers throwing a stone gets, maybe say you were naughty and maybe you do a day of social work and that's it. And that's by two different laws, and that's important.
Yes, and as I said, this is why sometimes these disputes, these legal disputes, do make their way to the Supreme Court. And as I did mention, there have been more than a few occasions where the Supreme Court will side with the Palestinian families against the Israelis. So it's not always as clear-cut as, well, these are two laws and that's the way it is. A lot of it is under contention. A lot of it is also ad hoc. If you happen to have a soldier who's more sympathetic to a Israeli settler, or a group that's there defending peace, and they're more sympathetic towards Israeli settlers, you're going to see one action as opposed to other actions by others. So a lot of it is not, there is systematic discrimination, I'm not questioning that, but it's not always as neatly established as, well, there's two rules and two laws, and this is policy and that's policy. It's more behavior that's inconsistent and that's wrong, frankly. That should be, there should be one system for everyone.
Maybe students in the back who have a question? Who are those who are actually attending the class in the Israeli military and are aiming at semi-experts by now? Okay. Well, if there's no more questions, allow me to thank our speaker one more time. Many thanks for coming, and we hope to have you back with your next book in a few years. Thank you.
Thank you.